East Cleveland residents deserve better. That was the mic drop line from the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office after Detective Ian McInnes was sentenced to 30 months in prison. No nuance, no analysis, just a headline and a hashtag pretending to be justice. But here's a question nobody seems to be brave enough to ask. Do they deserve better justice or just better PR? Because what happened to McInnes wasn't a conviction, it was a casting call. And he was handed the script after the credits had already rolled. Let's get this out of the way early. Ian McInnes was falsely convicted. Not because nothing happened, not because use of force should never be reviewed, but because the charges, the sentence, and an entire narrative were built on a foundation of political expedience, not legal integrity. In April 2025, McInnes, an East Cleveland detective known for his proactive hands-on approach to getting violent criminals off the street, was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for incidents tied to 3 arrests between 2020 and 2022. The charges? A cocktail of attempted felonious assault, interfering with civil rights, and dereliction of duty. Sounds serious, right? Until you actually look at what happened. No broken bones, no hospitalization, no dead suspects. Just 3 arrests, each involving suspects resisting, each escalating quickly, and each dissected in slow motion by prosecutors who had a political agenda to feed. What they needed wasn't reform. What they needed wasn't accountability. What they needed was a face, a couple headlines, a bunch of villains. And McInnes, young, white, brash, tattooed, and East Cleveland to his core, fit the mold perfectly. The problem? He wasn't a criminal. He was a cop doing a job in a city struggling to survive. But it was the county that didn't want to own its failures. So instead of fixing the system, they outsourced the blame to the most visible defenders. Let's break down the 3 components of the state's case against McInnes. Not the propaganda, not the tweets, the actual charges. Count 1, attempted felonious assault. This was the marquee offense, the headline grabber, the charge that made casual observers think McInnes had pistol whipped a grandmother. The reality? He delivered 2 strikes to a suspect during an arrest. Strikes that were captured partially on bodycam and blown up frame by frame in court like it was a Zapruder film. The suspect was resisting, the strike ended the resistance, and according to the training at the time, the technique was within reason, until prosecutors decided it wasn't. Funny how hindsight changes depending on who's in office. So counts 2 through 4, assault times 3. Now, here's where it gets rich. In all 3 cases, McInnes was accused of assaulting suspects during arrest. 2 of them actively resisted. The 3rd never filed a complaint until a prosecutor's investigator reached out nearly a year later. But we're supposed to believe that these were the kind of beatings that threatened public safety. Please. These weren't gratuitous acts of violence. They were split-second use of force decisions made during arrest that involved fleeing felons, non-compliant suspects, and on-scene confusion. The kind of moments every street cop deals with, but only some get charged for. Usually when the county needs to send a message. So counts 5 through 7, interfering with civil rights. Oh, the language sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Interfering with civil rights implies McInnes denied people their freedom to protest or lock someone in a basement. What it actually meant here was he arrested suspects with unnecessary force. The prosecution didn't like the tone of his reports, and he didn't file things in the exact sequence they wanted post-incident. Translation, he didn't fit their narrative. Counts 8 through 10, dereliction of duty. This one is the insult on top of the injury. According to the county, McInnes was guilty of dereliction of duty because he failed to intervene in one of the other arrests, where he was the primary officer, mid-use of force. That's right. They said he didn't intervene in his own actions. This is what happens when prosecutors decide the outcome first, then work backwards through body camera footage until they find something that sounds dramatic on paper. If you've read the press releases, you'd think Ian McInnes spent 2 years running around East Cleveland like a low-budget vigilante, handing out beatings for sport. But peel back the spin, watch the footage, and God forbid, read the actual reports, and a much different story emerges. The truth? McInnes wasn't assaulting people. He was making arrests in chaos and doing it under pressure in a department barely held together by duct tape and overtime logs. The kind of street-level enforcement other departments love to pretend that they still do, but wouldn't touch without 6 backup cars and a PIO standing by. So let's break it down. 3 incidents, 3 bodies, 0 hospitalizations, but somehow 10 charges, 30 months in prison. Let's go one by one. Incident number 1, February 25th, 2020, the kick that wasn't. This is the one they led with, the one they slow motioned to death in court, the one they sold as a vicious attack, hoping no one would ask for the raw footage. Here's what actually happened. Officers were attempting to stop a 24-year-old male. The suspect fled on foot. McInnes gave chase running full speed. As he closed the gap, he lost his footing, stumbled forward, and made contact with the suspect, who, by the way, was already on the ground after being tased by another officer. Did McInnes kick him? Technically, yes. Did he launch a calculated target strike? Absolutely not. The video clearly shows McInnes stumbling and nearly falling over the suspect, but you wouldn't know from the way the prosecution showed it in court. They kept pausing the footage just before the slip, cutting the context and presenting the contact as if it were intentional assault. No injuries, no complaint, no excessive use of force by policy standards. Just a frame-by-frame manipulation to make a stumble look like a stomp. And from that, they pulled a charge of attempted felonious assault. Because in Cuyahoga County, even gravity could be a felony if you're wearing the wrong badge. And just when you think it couldn't get any more ridiculous, enter Exhibit A in the political prosecution playbook, William Mitchell. Okay, let's take a moment to talk about a guy named William Mitchell. He and I were actually hired together, came up in the same ranks, and for a while, he was a solid cop until he wasn't. Somehow, along the way, Mitchell stopped serving the community and started serving himself. And when I was chief, it came to my attention that Mitchell, who, by the way, had been promoted to patrol division commander, was out there double dipping. What does that mean? Just that he was clocking in at East Cleveland, collecting a paycheck from the taxpayers, and then trotting off to work off-duty security gigs like he was running a personal side hustle on city time. And just to really drive the knife in, he was bumping junior officers off those details so he could pad his own wallet. Real leadership, huh? Well, I wasn't about to let that slide, so I did what any good chief would do. I sent a retired investigator to follow him, tailed him, filmed him, documented the whole operation. Then I requested the payroll records from the little off-duty empire. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office reviewed everything, and after he surrendered his certification, his OPATA certification, I terminated him. But Mitchell didn't go quietly. Oh no, he had an axe to grind. And when the Ian McInnes investigation started heating up, he suddenly transformed into the county's favorite stool pigeon. He wasted no time volunteering info about the so-called kick to the ribs incident. One problem though, the alleged victim had never even mentioned it. And that's not speculation, that's court testimony. When the victim took the stand, he literally said, "I didn't know I was a victim until the prosecutor's office told me I was." Let that sink in. He didn't report anything, didn't complain, didn't even realize he was supposed to be outraged until someone handed him a script. Because that's all this ever was, a production, a role to cast. And Mitchell, bitter, disgraced, and desperate to rewrite his legacy, was more than happy to play co-director. And just to put the cherry on the clown sundae, the guy they said Ian kicked, the one who didn't know he was a victim until someone had handed him a script, is now doing federal time. Yes, possession with intent to distribute, firearm in relation to drug trafficking crime, felon in possession, the whole federal buffet. That's your victim, ladies and gentlemen. So let's be clear, this wasn't about justice. This was about using whoever they could get to sell a narrative, even if that person had more felonies than complaints. Because in Cuyahoga County, it's not about who's credible, it's about who's convenient. And however, this one, the jury found McInnes not guilty of the attempted felonious assault. Maybe the guy saying he didn't know he was a victim rang out to them. So let's talk about incident number 2, October 3rd, 2021, and I've labeled it the groin kick that wasn't. According to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, McInnes ran up to a 16-year-old who had already surrendered after a vehicle pursuit and kicked him in the groin while he lay face down. That's the claim. Here's what actually happened. Straight from McInnes. Yes, they said I kicked him in the groin. However, I dropped my knee in his thigh. And that's actually a control tactic, a stabilization technique, one that's used across departments to pin a suspect's hip and limit movement during cuffing, especially when they are multiple fleeing suspects and adrenaline is running high. And the punchline? They told the jury there was no body cam footage. Zero, nada, just their word and a selective quote. But guess what? There is footage from McInnes' own camera. It exists. It's just being withheld, ignored, or conveniently labeled unavailable by the same system that claimed this was all about transparency. He's still fighting to retrieve it from the department, from Intrinsic, from anyone who hasn't buried it under a hard drive marked inconvenient. So what are we left with? A juvenile, at least at the time, he was a suspect, obviously, who was fleeing from police in a stolen vehicle. A non-lethal standard control movement delivered during arrest, and no injuries. Zero medical treatment. No complaint at the time, and a body cam that was supposedly missing until it wasn't. Yet somehow the prosecution turned that into a criminal act, because if you don't care about evidence, you can charge anyone with anything. So incident number 3, which occurred on February 14th, 2022. I've named this the back kick during a restaurant call. McInnes responded to a call involving a 42-year-old male at a restaurant. The man had been refusing to leave, displaying erratic behavior, and reportedly making other patrons uncomfortable. When McInnes arrived, he ordered the man, and the man was kneeling on the ground and facing away. As the man began placing his hands behind his back, McInnes observed a sudden movement toward the man's ankle. In that moment, believing the man might be reaching for a weapon or preparing to flee, McInnes made a split-second decision and delivered a forceful kick to the man's back, causing him to fall forward. What the media didn't report, and what the prosecutors didn't report, was McInnes was alone. He had no backup. Fully aware that other officers were providing CPR to a female nearby during an unrelated emergency, he had no margin for hesitation and had to make a judgment call under pressure. After the man was secured, it became clear this wasn't a textbook use of force scenario. The man had no identification and later signed out of the university hospital the next day against medical advice as John Doe. His caretaker later testified that she had thrown him out of her home for being violent and refusing to take medication. He wasn't drunk, he had documented mental disabilities and should have been under supervised care. At the time of the incident, McInnes suspected the man was under the influence of PCP or another narcotic due to his behavior. PCP was very common in East Cleveland. Wet, we would refer to it as. It was only after gaining control that the possibility of a psychiatric episode became clear, prompting McInnes to have him transported to the hospital for evaluation. No injuries, no ER treatment, no complaint filed, but the prosecution still called it criminal. So let's talk about the expert they pretended didn't exist. Here's the part the county really hopes you ignore. Ian McInnes had a use of force expert testify on his behalf. Not a buddy, not a cop from the same department, a recognized court-approved expert witness, trained, certified, and paid to evaluate law enforcement use of force subjectivity. He actually has written books. He is OPADA certified with use of force. And what did he say? That McInnes' actions, while maybe uncomfortable to watch on a loop with a dramatic music, fell within the boundaries of reasonable force. The back kick, a compliant takedown tactic often used in solo arrest scenarios. The knee to thigh move, unorthodox maybe, but tactically sound for suspect control. And the rib kick, that was a misstep during a foot chase, not a calculated assault. But the jury never heard that part emphasized. And the prosecutors, they dismissed it as biased, irrelevant, and one man's opinion despite it being the only testimony based on actual use of force science. Because when the outcome is already written, truth just gets in the way. So when the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office announced the charges against all of the officers, they spoke like they'd uncovered a criminal enterprise. Like Ian McInnes was East Cleveland's answer to Frank Serpico, if Serpico had a badge and a GoPro. They used phrases like egregious, unjustified, and a pattern of abuse. But what did they really have? 3 arrests involving resisting or non-compliant suspects. No civilian complaints filed at the time, no medical treatment, no internal affairs complaints, no force that exceeded department protocol until politics decided it did. Yet they convinced a jury that McInnes wasn't just out of line, he was a felon. And that's how a cop who never broke a bone, never lied on a report, never covered up anything, and never escalated a single scene into deadly force got 30 months in prison. Because in Cuyahoga County, you don't need a crime to convict, you just need a compelling storyline. Let's be honest here. This wasn't about fixing East Cleveland. This wasn't about building trust. This wasn't about community healing. This was about a prosecutor's office trying to score political wins off the backs of officers. Officers like Ian McInnes by offering up convictions as symbolic sacrifices. Because if you charge a cop, even one, whose actions are justified, you don't have to address the real prosecutorial failures in Cuyahoga County. You don't have to explain why repeat violent offenders keep getting plea deals, including some of these victims. You don't have to explain why homicide clearance rates are abysmal. You don't have to explain why your office didn't indict corrupt public officials when it mattered. You don't have to fix the backlog, the bond disparities, or the revolving doors of real predators. You don't have to address the street takeovers of the west side of Cleveland, which, Mike, that's your holy grail, the west side. You have to convict a cop, run it past the media, post the press release, then get back to business as usual. Because when perception matters more than principle, justice becomes a tool, not a standard. When it came time for sentencing, the stage was already set. The county had already had their headlines. The prosecutors had their moral outrage speeches rehearsed. The judge had her scripts. And Ian McInnes, he had a seat at the defendant's table like a man waiting to be sentenced for existing. This wasn't a criminal sentencing. It was content. It played out like the final episode of a courtroom miniseries, the kind you watch while yelling at the screen, not realizing that someone's actual life is getting torched in real time. And when the gavel dropped, the message was crystal clear. You're not being punished for what you did. You're being punished for who you are. Let's say this plainly. 2.5 years in prison for 3 arrests with 0 injuries. No hospitalizations, no broken bones, no weapons used, no civilians filing use of force complaints at the time. And just for fun, a lifetime ban on working in law enforcement via forced surrender of his OPATA certification, because Cuyahoga County doesn't do second chances if you wear a badge from East Cleveland. Compare that to a man convicted of felonious assault for breaking someone's jaw, 18 months suspended. A dealer caught with trafficking level fentanyl and a firearm, 12 months with credit for time served. A corrections officer who, by the way, was sentenced in the same exact court, punched a handcuffed inmate and knocked out his tooth. Misdemeanor plea, no prison. But McInnes, he gets 30 months because he stumbled during a foot pursuit, used a thigh pinning technique on a juvenile, and used a forceful takedown on an incoherent man refusing to leave a restaurant. Why? Because those charges had better optics. Not better facts, not more harm, better marketing. Victim impact. There was none. Let's pause and ask, where were the victims? Did anyone testify about permanent damage? Did anyone walk into the courtroom needing crutches, a brace, or even an apology? Nope. Because there was no victims. Not in the legal sense. Not in the human sense. Just 3 suspects who got arrested using standard reasonable force that was only rebranded as criminal once the political climate shifted. One of the so-called victims the prosecution leaned on, Deshaun Allen. The same Deshaun Allen who, within months of McInnes' charges, racked up breaking and entering, attempted carrying of a concealed weapon, attempted receiving of a stolen vehicle, failure to comply with a police signal, all felonies, all recent, all pled out, no contest, no problem. And yet this was the star of their show. This was the face of their Justice for Victims campaign. Let's be real. The prosecutors weren't protecting victims. They were propping up optics. They didn't care who was credible. They cared who was useful. Because if it's your goal to get in the headlines, the truth becomes optional. But that didn't stop the sideshow. Enter Mariah Crenshaw, a self-appointed policing expert who never attended a real law school, doesn't live in East Cleveland, and somehow still manages to insert herself into every high-profile officer case like she's auditioning for a Netflix docuseries. She calls herself a lead analyst on police accountability, but ask her where she got her credentials and you'll get a rant, not a resume. She's never worn a badge, never cleared a coroner, never filed a use of force report, but there she was, flapping her arms at press conferences, tweeting half-baked analysis, and speaking on behalf of a community she doesn't even live in. And prosecutors, they loved it. Because when you don't have real victims, you manufacture that moral outrage instead. Here's the bottom line. This wasn't justice. This was Netflix justice. The kind of sentence that looks good on camera, sounds powerful in a quote, and satisfies just enough voters to move the needle at the next election. Because in Cuyahoga County, you don't get sentenced for breaking the law, you get sentenced for breaking the narrative. And Ian McInnes was convicted the moment he didn't fit in. Let's take a break from the fiction and visit some reality. While Ian McInnes is sitting in prison for kicking a resisting adult during a solo arrest, dropping a knee on a fleeing juvenile, and failing to do paperwork exactly how the prosecutor likes it, actual violent criminals are walking out of the very same courthouse with lighter sentences, or no prison at all. Why? Because unlike McInnes, they weren't useful to the narrative. Let's look at the receipts. A Cleveland man arrested in 2023 after he punched his girlfriend in the face, broke her jaw, and shoved her into a wall during an argument. Suspended sentence, anger management, and community control. Why no prison? First-time offender, emotional stress. A repeat offender with a loaded firearm and trafficking level fentanyl in his backpack, arrested near a school zone. 12 months, time served, early release. A corrections officer caught on surveillance video punching a cuffed inmate so hard that he knocked his tooth out. Pled to a misdemeanor, paid a fine, got to keep his shoes. But McInnes, he lost his career, his certification, and his freedom for arrests that caused no injuries and followed the same use of force standards that half of Ohio's departments are still teaching today. This isn't about who's dangerous. It's about who's disposable. If you're a violent offender with the right backstory, there's a diversion program or a treatment bed or a soft-spoken judge who's all about second chances. If you're a cop, especially one from a department like East Cleveland, there's only one story being told. You're the villain, full stop. It's not about justice. It's about casting. McInnes got the role of corrupt cop, and no amount of testimony, video evidence, or expert analysis could change that script. Not once prosecutors realized that this wasn't a trial, it was a message. So, what's the lesson? The next officer watching body cam footage in a training class, he's not learning how to de-escalate. He's learning how not to become the next Ian McInnes. The next prosecutor looking to distract from a failed gang indictment, they're not looking at who's guilty. They're looking at who's marketable. And the next judge trying to boost their accountability credentials, they're not asking whether the sentence fits. They're asking whether it sounds good in the press. Meanwhile, the guy who breaks a jaw walks free. The guy who traffics drugs walks free. The guy who assaults a cuffed prisoner gets a plea deal. And Ian McInnes, he gets to write inmate on his tax forms because he chased the wrong suspects in the wrong city at the wrong political moment. When you walk into a courtroom, you're told it's a place of fairness, neutrality, and balance. But when Ian McInnes walked into the courtroom for sentencing, what he got wasn't a judge. He got a brand manager in a robe. This wasn't about facts. This wasn't about justice. This was about optics. And in the hands of the court, McInnes' trial became extremely what the system needed. A convenient piece of political theater to validate a broken narrative. I know this may be getting monotonous, but let's recap the facts one more time. 3 arrests, 0 serious injuries, use of force expert said his tactics were justifiable, body cam footage was misrepresented, and in one case hidden, no pattern of misconduct, no attempts to cover up any incident, no complaints at the time of the arrest. Yet the judge treated him like a predator who just walked out of a federal racketeering case. The courtroom became a stage, the sentence became a statement, and the judge, she didn't just rule, she performed. From the tone of the sentencing remarks to the pacing of the decisions, it was clear this wasn't about delivering the law. This was about delivering a message to the press. One that read, "We hold cops accountable here, even when they're not guilty." Let's be blunt. If Ian McInnes had been anyone else, especially a civilian with a public defender, this case would have been diverted, reduced, or tossed out entirely. But the court had other priorities. They wanted to show the public that justice was even-handed, that they were finally reining in law enforcement. But instead of fixing the real issues, prosecutorial abuse, actual excessive force, corrupt internal investigations, they threw the book at the easiest political target in the room. Because if you convict a police officer, especially one from a department already on the political chopping block, you don't have to deal with the messy stuff like why violent criminals keep walking, why the community doesn't trust the justice system, why your own office fails to prosecute obvious misconduct from its own people. You just slam the gavel, smile for the press, and move on. And as of late, it wouldn't be a Cuyahoga County show trial without Mariah Crenshaw, orbiting the scene like a satellite dish in search of camera crews. She wasn't a witness, she wasn't an expert, she didn't even know the victims or live in the jurisdiction, but there she was, tweeting from the hallway, offering quotes to the press, nodding dramatically in the galley as if she were co-counsel. And for the judge, that was gold, because when Mariah speaks, the microphone turns on, and when the microphones turn on, the gavel gets a little heavier. Judges aren't supposed to have an audience, but she did. Instead of checking the prosecutor's political ambition, the judge amplified it. Instead of weighing the facts against the law, she weighed the press clippings against her own next endorsement, let alone that her husband is the PR for the prosecutor's office. Instead of protecting fairness, she protected the narrative. This wasn't adjudication. It was auditioning. And now McInnes will be serving time, not because of what he did, but because of what it looked like to people who never bothered to look deeper. This case was never just about Ian McInnes. It was about making a point. From the charges to the press releases to the sentencing, every move was choreographed for the cameras. Not the cause of justice, but the most dangerous part of all. The part that should scare anyone who ever finds themselves in a courtroom. What the judge allowed and what she didn't. One of the most outrageous moments of McInnes' trial wasn't even about what the prosecution said. It was about what the judge ruled. McInnes in his defense presented what's called an affirmative defense. That's his actions were lawful under his authority as a police officer. That his use of force was reasonable based on training and circumstances. What did the judge say? She ruled that McInnes had to prove it. Let that sink in. Instead of the state having to prove that his actions were unlawful, the court shifted the burden onto him, the defendant, to prove that his actions were justified. Not beyond a reasonable doubt, just by a preponderance of the evidence, but still, it flipped the entire trial dynamic. This wasn't the prosecution proving guilt. This was the defense being forced to prove innocence. And if that doesn't terrify you, it should. Let's circle back to the defense's expert, a certified, court-approved use of force analyst who reviewed the body cam footage and said flat out, McInnes' actions were within policy. But the court didn't give the testimony the weight it deserved. The prosecution downplayed it, the judge didn't emphasize it, and the jury was never properly instructed that a reasonable use of force does not become illegal just because it looks ugly on video. Instead, the court let the prosecution walk the jury straight into an emotional verdict because emotion sells. Facts, training, policy, not so much. And let's not forget those jury instructions. Rather than clearly explaining what a lawful use of force by a police officer looks like, the judge let vague, generalized language stand. Language that made it sound like any use of force that isn't perfect must be a crime. The jury didn't get clarity. They got a script, one that made conviction easier and accountability for the county harder. This case wasn't about public safety. It was about publicity. Ian McInnes was convicted not because of what he did, but because of what his conviction could be used for by a prosecutor, by a judge, by a self-proclaimed activist who never even wore a badge. And the next time a cop has to make a split-second decision, they'll remember this. It doesn't matter if it's justified. It doesn't matter if no one's hurt. It doesn't even matter if it's policy. If the optics are bad, you're done. So if you made it this far, congratulations. You've just walked through a story that's not just tragic, it's instructive. The case of Ian McInnes isn't an isolated failure. It's a signal flare for anyone who still thinks the courtroom is a neutral space, where evidence matters and justice has a blindfold on. Spoiler alert, the only thing blindfolded in Cuyahoga County is accountability. So what did Ian actually do? He made arrests, he chased suspects, he used force per training, he had 0 complaints filed at the time, and he had a qualified expert back him up. Yet he's going to prison. Not for misconduct, but for being an easy symbol. He wasn't the problem. He was the product of a justice system trying to sell itself as reform. To the prosecutors, you know this was political. You didn't make streets safer. You didn't reform a system. You didn't make justice more fair. You just made headlines. You targeted a cop who didn't fit your narrative. You threw 10 charges at him like darts at a campaign poster. You sat back while your courtroom theater ran, knowing the facts didn't justify a conviction, but also knowing that a conviction justified your narrative. You didn't win a case, you weaponized the courtroom. To the judge, you didn't deliver justice, you delivered optics. You flipped the burden of proof, you let emotion override evidence, you gave the public a sentencing monologue while turning your back on the legal clarity. You didn't temper the fire, you poured gasoline on it. And when history looks back, it's not going to see you as a voice of reason. It's going to see you as a bench politician who let Twitter threads carry more weight than sworn testimony. To Maria Crenshaw, you don't speak for the community. You don't even know East Cleveland residents. You're not an expert. You're not a lawyer, and you don't live in East Cleveland. You're a career clout chaser who opportunistically inserts herself into high-profile prosecutions and pretends to speak for people who never asked for your opinion. You were never there when the calls for service went sideways. You weren't there when the suspects ran. You've never faced a real-life split-second decision, and you're damn sure don't carry the weight of a badge. But you're more than happy to help prosecute the ones who do. You didn't help this case. You polluted it. You helped turn public perception into a weapon and the courtroom into a stage. To the public, don't let them tell you this was real reform. They'll tell you this case is what accountability looks like. They'll say justice was served. They'll say East Cleveland is safer. But it isn't, and you know it, because when good cops back out, when the next pursuit doesn't happen, when the next suspect walks because an officer didn't want to be the next Ian McInnes, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that they didn't convict a criminal. They convicted a cop who happened to be in the crosshairs of public relations. To every officer watching, be loud, be smart, be ready, because if this is how they treat a decorated detective with no prior discipline, clear video, and expert backing, you better believe they're coming for you next. Don't be silent, don't hide, and don't let them twist your service into a sentence. Final thought. Justice doesn't need a press release. Truth doesn't need a headline, and no cop should need to survive a courtroom just to survive the job. Be loud, be heard, and shake the system until the truth falls out.